Ever wonder what it takes to be medically cleared to fly a plane? Or
Hmm.
how your body reacts to, the thin air at 30,000 feet? Well, get ready because you're about to become very well informed on something most people never think twice about: the hidden human factors that can honestly make or break a flight.
Yeah, and this isn't just for pilots. We're going to uncover how our bodies react in the air, why some things are riskier than others, and how to stay safe up there, even as a passenger.
Right. We're diving deep into excerpts from the FAA Pilot Training Manual, Chapter 17 to be exact, which, let me tell you, is packed with fascinating insights.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about why dry ice is a huge EE no-no on planes, how alcohol really affects you at altitude, and why staring at a light in the dark can be dangerous for pilots.
Okay, so let's start with the basics: medical certifications. What does it take for a pilot to get cleared for takeoff?
Well, the FAA takes pilot health very seriously. They have different classes of medical certificates, depending on the kind of flying a pilot does. So think of it like a tiered system. Like if you're just flying for fun, a third-class medical certificate will do.
Okay.
But for commercial pilots or airline captains, it's a more stringent first-class certificate.
So does that mean if you have a pre-existing condition, you're automatically grounded?
Not necessarily. There's this thing called a Statement of Demonstrated Ability, or SOTA.
Soda.
Yeah, SODA.
Okay.
It's incredible, really. Pilots with conditions like impaired vision or even a missing limb can still fly if they
Wow.
can prove they can do it safely.
That's amazing. Talk about determination. But I'm guessing there are some conditions that are absolute no-goes, like, right?
Yes, but even then, there's often a path forward.
Hmm.
So there are 15 conditions that automatically trigger, like, a closer look.
Yeah.
Things like diabetes requiring medication, certain heart conditions, psychological disorders. But many pilots with these conditions can apply for a special issuance authorization. They basically demonstrate to the FAA that their condition is stable and doesn't pose a safety risk.
So it's not a blanket ban.
Right.
The FAA is really working to make flying as accessible as possible while still prioritizing safety. Okay, now let's talk about what happens to our bodies once we're up in the air, starting with hypoxia. Everyone knows it's about a lack of oxygen, but what's really going on?
Well, as you climb higher, the percentage of oxygen in the air stays the same, but the pressure decreases.
Okay.
This means fewer oxygen molecules are reaching your lungs with each breath.
So it's like trying to breathe through a straw.
That's a good analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
And you might think you'd just feel breathless, but the scary thing is hypoxia can make you feel euphoric, almost drunk.
Hmm.
That's why it's so dangerous, right?
Yeah.
You might be making critical errors in judgment and not even realize it.
You know how people say you feel happy right before you pass out? That must be the hypoxia talking.
Exactly. And that's why pilots carry oxygen, right?
Hmm.
To avoid those euphoric moments that could lead to fatal mistakes. But here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
There are actually 4 types of hypoxia.
4.
Yeah. So hypoxia is the classic altitude-induced kind we just talked about. But then there's hypemic hypoxia, where your blood can't carry enough oxygen. So imagine being poisoned by carbon monoxide. Your blood is literally being robbed of its oxygen-carrying capacity.
That sounds terrifying. Okay, so what about the other 2 types?
Well, stagnant hypoxia happens when blood itself isn't flowing properly. So
Mm.
think extreme cold or shock, anything that restricts blood flow to your tissues.
Okay.
And finally, there's histotoxic hypoxia. This is when your cells can't use oxygen effectively, even if it's readily available.
Mm-hmm.
So alcohol and certain drugs can cause this type of hypoxia.
So all 4 types are essentially disrupting the oxygen flow in different ways.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to recognize the symptoms early on. Right? If you're feeling lightheaded, dizzy, or even unusually happy at altitude, it's a sign that your brain isn't getting enough oxygen.
So what should you do if you suspect hypoxia?
Well, the most important thing is to increase your oxygen intake.
Okay.
So if you're on a plane, put on your oxygen mask immediately.
Right.
Pilots are trained to descend to a lower altitude where the air is denser. And of course, if you're experiencing severe symptoms, seek medical attention right away.
Okay, so hypoxia is clearly a serious threat. But what about when our breathing gets out of whack in the other direction? Let's talk about hyperventilation.
Well, hypoxia is all about not getting enough oxygen. Hyperventilation is more about breathing too rapidly,
Mm-hmm.
causing an imbalance of carbon dioxide in your blood.
So it's more about an overreaction of the respiratory system, often triggered by stress or anxiety.
Exactly. And ironically, some of the symptoms can mimic hypoxia. Lightheadedness, tingling, visual disturbances. You might also experience hot or cold sensations, even muscle spasms.
So how do you know if you're hyperventilating? or actually experiencing hypoxia.
If you suspect hyperventilation, try slowing your breathing down, taking deep, controlled breaths. Breathing into a paper bag can also help restore that proper carbon dioxide balance. But if you're on oxygen and still experiencing symptoms, that's a red flag that something more serious might be going on.
Speaking of feeling dizzy, did you know that even something as simple as a cold can wreak havoc on your ears and sinuses during a flight?
It's all about those pesky pressure changes during climbs and descents. We've all felt that fullness or popping in our ears, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's because we have these air-filled cavities in our bodies, like our ears and sinuses. And as the pressure outside changes, the air inside these cavities needs to equalize.
So when the pressure changes too quickly and that air can't equalize fast enough, that's when the cane sets in.
Precisely. The eustachian tube, which connects the middle ear to the back of the throat, plays a key role in this equalization process. That's why swallowing, yawning, or chewing gum can help open up those tubes and relieve the pressure.
And the Valsalva maneuver, where you pinch your nostrils and gently blow, that's a classic.
Yeah, it can be effective, but it's important to do it gently.
Right.
Forcing the pressure can actually damage your eardrums. And if you're really congested, it's best to avoid flying altogether.
Yeah.
Trying to equalize pressure with a blocked eustachian tube is a recipe for pain and potentially even a ruptured eardrum.
So no heroic attempts to fly through a cold no matter how important that meeting is.
Yeah.
Okay. What about decongestants? Can they help?
Well, they might offer temporary relief, but they're not a foolproof solution. Like, decongestant sprays might not provide enough relief at higher altitudes. And oral decongestants can actually impair a pilot's performance. They can cause drowsiness, dizziness, and even affect your blood pressure, which is not what you want when you're at the controls of a plane.
So if you're battling a cold or sinus infection, the best advice is to stay grounded. And for our pilots out there, remember that even over-the-counter medications can have side effects that might affect your ability to fly safely. Always consult with your aviation medical examiner, or AME, before taking anything, even if it seems harmless.
Now, ready for a trip into the Twilight Zone?
Hmm.
Let's talk about something called spatial disorientation.
This sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. What is spatial disorientation exactly?
Imagine being blindfolded, spun around on a merry-go-round, and then asked to walk in a straight line. You're going to feel completely disoriented, right?
Yeah.
Your body's telling you one thing, but your sense of direction is totally lost. That's what pilots can experience in the air, and it's called spatial disorientation.
So it's basically the inability to determine the aircraft's position, attitude, or movement in space. Like your inner GPS is malfunctioning.
Exactly. And it happens when our brains receive conflicting information from our senses. Our inner ear, which senses balance and motion, might be telling us one thing, while our eyes, which rely on visual cues, are telling us something else.
And at night, or in low visibility conditions, those visual cues can be unreliable or even completely absent.
Right. Exactly. That's when things can get really tricky. Like, our inner ear might be telling us we're turning, but our instruments are saying we're flying straight and level.
So how do pilots train to overcome these disorienting illusions?
Well, the first step is understanding how they work. Knowing how your body and senses can be tricked is crucial for recognizing when you're experiencing spatial disorientation. And then it's all about learning to trust your instruments, even when your senses are screaming otherwise.
So it's almost like developing a healthy distrust of your own senses.
More like understanding their limitations and knowing when to prioritize the information provided by your instruments. Think of it like this, like your senses are like the passenger in the car, offering opinions and observations. But the instruments are the driver, the ones with the map, and the expertise to get you to your destination safely.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's talk about some specific spatial disorientation illusions that pilots might encounter. What are some of the most common ones?
One of the classics is called the leans. So imagine you've been in a prolonged, gradual turn, so subtle you might not even realize it. Then, when the aircraft levels out, you suddenly feel like you're banking in the opposite direction. Your body is still catching up to the reality of the situation.
It's like that feeling you get after stepping off a spinning amusement park ride.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's the Coriolis illusion, which can be particularly unsettling. This happens when you move your head quickly during a turn, say look at an instrument. It messes with the fluid in your inner ear, creating this sensation that you're turning or accelerating on a completely different axis than you actually are.
So you might instinctively try to correct for a movement that isn't actually happening.
Precisely. And that can lead to, like, some pretty disorienting and potentially dangerous maneuvers, especially if a pilot isn't trained to rely on their instruments.
These illusions sound like they could get pretty hairy. Is there anything else pilots should be aware of?
Oh, there's one more you definitely don't want to experience: the graveyard spiral. This is one of the most dangerous spatial disorientation illusions because it can lead to a loss of control and a fatal crash.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How does this graveyard spiral work?
Imagine you're in a prolonged turn, losing altitude. As that sensation of turning fades over time, you start to feel like you're in a level descent. You instinctively pull back on the controls to climb, but instead of climbing, you actually tighten the spiral and descend even faster.
Oh, wow.
It's a classic example of how relying solely on your senses in low visibility conditions can be catastrophic.
So it's a deadly combination of a sensory illusion and an incorrect response.
Exactly. That's why instrument training is so critical for pilots. It's all about learning to trust your instruments, even when your senses are telling you otherwise.
Before we move on, let's quickly touch on motion sickness. It's not as dramatic as spatial disorientation, but it can definitely make for a miserable flight.
Motion sickness or air sickness is another example of our senses getting crossed. Your inner ear is telling your brain you're moving, while your eyes, focused inside the aircraft, are saying you're stationary.
Right.
This sensory mismatch can lead to nausea, dizziness, and that dreaded feeling of wanting to hurl.
And are there any ways to combat motion sickness?
Fresh air can help. As can focusing on a distant object, outside the aircraft. Avoiding unnecessary head movements is also key. And if you're a passenger, let the flight attendants know you're feeling queasy. They might be able to move you to a seat with less motion or offer you a sick bag and some ginger ale.
And for our pilots out there, if you're prone to motion sickness, what's the best course of action?
Communication is key.
Okay.
Let your instructor or co-pilot know, and they can adjust the flight path or maneuvers to minimize those sickening sensations.
Right.
And remember, while there are medications that can help, they can also cause drowsiness and other side effects that could impair your performance. So it's best to avoid them if you're flying.
Okay, let's move on to a silent, invisible threat that can strike even in the most modern aircraft: carbon monoxide poisoning.
This is a good reminder that danger isn't always visible or dramatic. Carbon monoxide, or CO, is a colorless, odorless gas produced by the incomplete combustion of fuels.
And because it's undetectable to our senses, it can be incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. It's like a silent thief that robs your body of its ability to carry oxygen. CO binds to hemoglobin in your red blood cells, the same molecule that carries oxygen, and it does so with an affinity about 200 times stronger than oxygen.
So even a small amount of CO can displace a significant amount of oxygen in your blood.
Precisely. And at altitude, where the air is thinner and your body's already working harder to get oxygen, the effects of CO poisoning are amplified.
What are some of the symptoms of CO poisoning?
Early on, you might experience headache, blurred vision, dizziness, and drowsiness. As it progresses, you might experience weakness, confusion, and even loss of consciousness.
This sounds like a serious in-flight emergency. What should pilots do if they suspect CO poisoning?
Immediate action is key.
Okay.
The first step is to increase ventilation, like by opening windows or vents if possible.
Right.
Then, if supplemental oxygen is available, use it immediately. And of course, land the aircraft as soon as possible and seek medical attention.
And this is a good reminder for everyone, even passengers. If you smell exhaust fumes in the cabin, don't hesitate to notify the flight attendants. It could be a sign of a CO leak.
Absolutely. It's always better to err on the side of caution when it comes to CO. And it's worth noting that tobacco smoke also contributes to CO levels in the air.
Okay, let's move on to a topic that affects all of us, both in the air and on the ground: stress and fatigue.
These are often invisible factors that can significantly impact our performance and decision-making, especially in the demanding environment of flight.
So let's start with stress. We all experience it, but how does it affect our ability to fly safely?
Think about what happens to your body when you're stressed. Your heart rate increases, your blood pressure rises, you might even start sweating. This fight or flight response is designed to help us deal with short-term threats, but when it's triggered chronically, it can wreak havoc on our bodies and minds.
So prolonged stress can actually lead to a decline in our cognitive abilities.
Exactly. It can impair our judgment, make it harder to focus, and even increase our susceptibility to errors. And in flight, where split-second decisions can be critical, that can have serious consequences.
And what about fatigue? We all know what it feels like to be tired, but how does it affect us physiologically?
Fatigue is essentially your body's way of telling you to slow down and rest. It's a state of, decreased physical and mental performance that can result from a lack of sleep, prolonged exertion, or even emotional stress.
So it's not just about feeling sleepy, it can actually impair our ability to function.
Absolutely. Fatigue can slow our reaction time, make it harder to concentrate, and even affect our mood and judgment.
And let's not forget skill fatigue, which can affect even experienced pilots.
This is a more insidious form of fatigue that can creep up on you even if you're well rested.
Oh, okay.
It's essentially the mental exhaustion that comes from performing repetitive tasks or operating in a high-stress environment for an extended period. It can make even familiar procedures feel unfamiliar and increase the likelihood of errors.
So what's the bottom line for pilots when it comes to stress and fatigue?
Self-awareness is key.
Right.
If you're feeling stressed or fatigued, it's crucial to address those issues before stepping into the cockpit. There's no shame in grounding yourself for safety's sake. It's always better to be on the ground wishing you were in the air than in the air wishing you were on the ground.
Okay, I think we need a little mental break from those intense topics. But staying with the theme of things that can mess with your head in the air, let's talk about aircraft fluids.
Not as exciting as, say, battling a graveyard spiral,
Right.
but definitely just as critical for safety.
You wouldn't think something like hydraulic fluid or engine oil would be a big deal.
But you're dealing with substances that can be corrosive, flammable, even toxic.
Right.
And the risks are higher, when you're in a confined space like a cockpit.
What are the key things pilots need to know about handling these fluids safely?
First and foremost, understand what you're dealing with. Like each fluid has its own set of hazards. That's where those material safety data sheets, or MSDS, come in handy.
MSDS.
Yeah, they're like a safety Bible for aircraft fluids.
I'm picturing a pilot with a little laminated card tucked into their pocket, like a cheat sheet for hazardous materials.
Pretty much. But seriously, the MSDS provides crucial information, everything from first aid procedures to proper storage and disposal.
So let's say a pilot accidentally splashes some hydraulic fluid on their skin. What should they do?
The key is to act quickly. So remove any contaminated clothing, wash the affected area thoroughly with soap and water, and keep an eye out for any irritation or redness. And if it gets in your eyes, flush with clean water immediately.
Okay, got it. Wash, rinse, repeat. What about inhalation or ingestion? Those seem a lot more serious.
You're right. Those are situations where you need to seek medical attention right away. Inhalation of fumes, especially in a confined space, can lead to respiratory problems, dizziness, even unconsciousness. And ingesting any of these fluids is definitely a medical emergency.
So the takeaway here is to be extra cautious when handling aircraft fluids, right? Wear gloves, eye protection, work in a well-ventilated area. And if an accident happens, don't hesitate to seek medical attention. Better safe than sorry.
Speaking of things that can make you feel a little queasy, let's move on to dehydration and heat stroke.
Wait, aren't those more of a concern for, marathon runners in the desert?
They can be, but you'd be surprised how quickly dehydration can sneak up on you, even in a climate-controlled cockpit, especially on long flights or in hot climates.
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about pilots getting dehydrated.
It's more common than you think. You're in a dry environment at altitude, maybe focused on a challenging flight, and you forget to drink enough water. By the time you feel thirsty, you're already somewhat dehydrated.
So what's the big deal about being a little dehydrated?
Well, it can impair your cognitive function, slow your reaction time, even lead to fatigue and headaches. And in extreme cases, it can progress to heat stroke, which is a life-threatening condition.
Okay, now I'm getting a little thirsty just thinking about this. So how can pilots stay hydrated and beat the heat?
It sounds simple, but the most important thing is to drink plenty of water, even if you don't feel thirsty.
Okay.
Carry a water bottle with you and make it a habit to sip on it regularly throughout the flight. Avoid those sugary drinks and caffeine, which can actually dehydrate you.
And what about heat stroke? What are the warning signs? And what should you do if you suspect it?
Heat stroke is essentially when your body's cooling system overloads, and it just can't keep up. So along with those typical dehydration symptoms like fatigue, headache, dizziness, you might experience rapid pulse, flushed skin, even confusion or disorientation. If you suspect heat stroke, it's crucial to cool down immediately. Get to a shaded or air-conditioned environment, loosen clothing, and drink cool water if possible. And of course, seek medical attention right away.
So staying hydrated is not just about comfort, it's about staying sharp and alert. Speaking of things that can impair your judgment, let's tackle the topic everyone's curious about, alcohol and drugs.
Ah, yes, the myths and realities of the 2-drink limit and what the FAA doesn't know.
Exactly. Let's clear the air. What are the hard and fast rules about alcohol and flying?
The FAA has a strict 8-hour bottle-to-throttle rule. That means you must abstain from alcohol for at least 8 hours before flying.
8 hours?
Yeah. And there's also a blood alcohol limit of 0.04%, which is lower than the legal driving limit in most states.
But here's where it gets tricky. Like, even if you're under the blood alcohol limit, you still can't fly within 8 hours of drinking.
That's right. The FAA isn't messing around.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that alcohol's effects are actually amplified at altitude.
Hold on. Are you telling me I can't enjoy a glass of wine with my in-flight meal? How is that even enforced?
Well, for passengers, it's more about responsible consumption. But for pilots, it's a serious matter. Like, random alcohol testing is common. And any violation can result in severe penalties, including the loss of your pilot's license. And think about it, you're responsible for the lives of everyone on board. Is that glass of wine really worth the risk?
Good point. Okay, so alcohol is a no-go. What about medications?
The FAA is equally strict about medications. Like, any drug that could potentially impair your ability to fly safely is prohibited.
So what about over-the-counter meds, like allergy pills or decongestants?
Even those can be a problem. You might think they're harmless, right? But they can cause drowsiness, dizziness, or even interact with other medications in, unpredictable ways.
So the key is to consult with an AME before flying while taking any medication, even over-the-counter ones.
Absolutely. They can assess your individual situation and advise you on the safest course of action. And of course, illegal drugs are completely off limits for pilots. There's no room for debate on that one.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of staying healthy and alert in the air. Now I want to talk about something that seems a little out of left field. Decompression sickness, or DCS.
DCS.
Yeah, it's the same thing scuba divers get,
Well,
right?
exactly. You might think it only happens underwater, but pilots, especially those flying unpressurized aircraft at high altitudes, can also be at risk.
Wait, so I can get the bends from flying. That seems counterintuitive.
It all comes down to nitrogen. It's
Yeah.
like the most abundant gas in our atmosphere.
Wow.
Under normal conditions, nitrogen is dissolved in our body fluids. But as you ascend and the pressure decreases, this dissolved nitrogen can come out of solution and form bubbles.
I'm picturing those little bubbles you see in a bottle of soda when you open it.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And those bubbles, if they form in your tissues or bloodstream, can cause all sorts of problems.
Like the bends,
Mhm.
which I've always imagined as excruciating joint pain.
That's a classic symptom. But DCS can also manifest as neurological problems, skin rashes, even breathing difficulties. In severe cases, it can be fatal.
So what should a pilot do if they suspect they're experiencing DCS?
The most important thing is to descend to a lower altitude and land as soon as possible. If oxygen is available, use it. And once on the ground, seek immediate medical attention.
And this is where it gets interesting for our scuba diving listeners. Because scuba diving exposes your body to increased pressure, it increases your risk of DCS during flight.
Exactly. That's why the FAA has strict guidelines about flying after diving. So generally, you need to wait at least 12 hours after a no decompression dive, and at least 24 hours after a decompression dive before flying. And for flights above 8,000 feet, the waiting period is 24 hours, regardless of the type of dive.
So the key takeaway for our divers out there is to plan your flights carefully after a dive. And if you experience any unusual symptoms in the air, don't hesitate to alert the crew. Now, let's talk about something absolutely essential for pilots. Vision.
Vision.
Yeah. I never thought about how much our eyes have to work when we fly.
We take vision for granted, but it's the primary sense we use to, navigate the world, especially when flying. It's how we judge distances, maintain spatial orientation, and avoid hazards.
But at 30,000 feet, things look a lot different than they do on the ground.
Absolutely. And at night, or in low visibility conditions, the challenges are even greater. That's why understanding how our eyes work in flight is so critical.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What are the different types of vision?
We actually use 3 main types of vision: photopic, mesopic, and scotopic. Photopic vision is our daytime vision when we have, plenty of light.
Okay.
It's our sharpest, most detailed vision, and it allows us to see the full spectrum of colors.
So that's the vision we use when we're reading the instruments or scanning the horizon on a bright sunny day.
Exactly. Then, as the sun starts to set and light levels decrease, we transition to mesopic vision. This is our twilight vision. So our color perception starts to fade, and our visual acuity or sharpness diminishes.
And what about when it gets really dark?
That's when our scopic vision or night vision kicks in. Our cones, the color-sensing cells in our eyes, are basically useless in low light, so we rely on our rods, which are much more sensitive to light, but can only see in shades of gray.
So our night vision is basically black and white. No wonder everything looks so different at night.
Exactly. And it takes time for our eyes to adapt to darkness.
Yeah.
This process, called dark adaptation, can take up to 30 minutes for our rods to become fully sensitive.
That's why it's so jarring when you, walk out of a brightly lit room into a dark night.
Exactly. And for pilots, maintaining dark adaptation is crucial for safe night flying. Even a brief exposure to bright light can disrupt the process and significantly reduce your night vision.
So no checking your phone in the cockpit during a night flight.
Definitely not. And speaking of things that can interfere with our vision, let's talk about the blind spot.
Wait, we all have a blind spot. I thought that was just something in those driver's ed videos.
Everyone has a blind spot in each eye. It's the area where the optic nerve connects to the retina, and there are no light-sensitive cells there.
So there's literally a spot in our field of vision where we can't see anything.
That's right. But luckily, under normal circumstances, we don't even notice it because our brains are so good at, filling in that missing information using input from our other eye.
But in flight, especially when you're scanning for traffic or obstacles, that blind spot could be a problem, right?
Absolutely. That's why pilots need to be aware of its existence and compensate for it by scanning thoroughly and using both eyes whenever possible. Another visual challenge for pilots is something called empty field myopia.
Empty field.
What? It's basically a focusing problem that can occur when there are no distinct objects to focus on, like when you're flying over clouds or a featureless terrain.
So your eyes kind of zone out, because there's nothing interesting to look at.
Exactly. The eyes relax and adopt a comfortable focal distance that might be too close for safety.
So you might not see an approaching aircraft or obstacle until it's too late.
That's the danger. To prevent empty field myopia, pilots need to consciously focus on distant objects, even if they're dim or blurry. Scanning the horizon or focusing on a distant light can help keep your eyes properly focused.
Okay, now let's talk about night vision in more detail. It seems like there's a lot that can go wrong when you're flying in the dark.
You're right, night flying presents its own unique set of challenges. As we discussed, our rods are responsible for night vision, but they're not as sharp or detailed as our cones.
Okay.
And to make matters worse, we have a night blind spot right in the center of our vision.
Wait, another blind spot.
It's actually the same blind spot.
Oh, okay.
But it's more noticeable at night because our rods are concentrated in our peripheral vision, leaving a gap in the center.
So how do we see anything at night if we have a blind spot right in the middle of our vision?
We have to use a technique called off-center viewing. So instead of looking directly at an object, we look slightly to the side, using the more sensitive rods in our peripheral vision.
It's like a magic trick for your eyes.
Exactly. And another important technique for night flying is scanning. Instead of fixating on a single point, pilots need to sweep their eyes back and forth across their field of vision, overlapping the scans to make sure they don't miss anything.
So it's all about staying vigilant and actively searching for visual cues.
Absolutely. And remember, bright lights are the enemy of night vision. Pilots need to avoid bright lights as much as possible before and during night flights.
And what about those weird visual illusions that can trick our eyes at night? We talked about autokinesis earlier, where a stationary light can appear to move. Are there any other illusions pilots need to watch out for?
Oh, there are quite a few. One of the most disorienting is the false horizon. This occurs when the natural horizon is obscured, maybe by clouds or darkness, and your brain mistakes other visual cues for the horizon.
So you might think you're flying straight and level when you're actually banking or even descending.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to rely on your instruments at night and not just your visual perception.
Okay, so we got autokinesis and the false horizon. What else?
There's also the reversible perspective illusion, which can make it difficult to judge the direction of travel of another aircraft, especially if it's flying parallel to you. You might think it's moving away when it's actually approaching.
That sounds like a recipe for a mid-air collision.
It can be. And another illusion that can mess with our depth perception is the size-distance illusion. This one is based on the fact that as an object gets closer, it appears larger.
Right. So if you see a light that's getting brighter, you might assume it's getting closer, even if it's just a stationary light.
Exactly, and that can be especially dangerous during a night landing when judging distances accurately is critical.
So it seems like night flying requires a whole other level of awareness and vigilance compared to daytime flying.
Absolutely, and we haven't even touched on all the potential distractions and hazards that can arise at night.
Okay, well, let's save those for another deep dive. But before we move on, are there any other key takeaways about vision that our listeners should keep in mind?
Here's the big one. Vision is a complex process that can be affected by a multitude of factors, like lighting conditions, fatigue, hypoxia, even certain medications. So if you're a pilot, it's crucial to be aware of these factors and take steps to mitigate them.
So make sure you're well rested, hydrated, and haven't popped any questionable pills before hopping in the cockpit.
Exactly. And remember, good vision isn't just about having 20/20 eyesight. It's about understanding how our eyes work in the unique environment of flight and knowing how to compensate for their limitations.
All right, let's take a breather here and come back to explore some final crucial aeromedical factors. We'll talk about the importance of pre-flight planning and a handy little checklist that can help you stay safe, whether you're flying a plane or just driving to the grocery store. Stay tuned.
Welcome back for the final leg of our aeromedical journey.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the physiological effects of altitude to those visual illusions that can play tricks on our eyes.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on something that might seem a bit mundane, but is absolutely crucial for safety, both in the air and on the ground.
I think I know where you're going with this pre-flight planning.
It's easy to overlook, especially when you're excited to get airborne.
But taking a few moments to assess your physical and mental state before you fly, it can make all the difference. And there's this handy little checklist pilots use to guide this self-assessment. It's called the MSAFE checklist.
MSAFE, I love a good mnemonic. What does it stand for?
It stands for illness medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion.
So it's basically a reminder to check in with yourself and make sure you're in the right headspace and physical condition to fly.
Exactly. Let's break it down. First up, illness. Are you feeling under the weather? Do you have a cold, a headache, an upset stomach? Anything that could potentially distract you or impair your performance is a red flag.
Next, medication. Have you taken any medications recently, even over-the-counter ones, as we discussed earlier? Even seemingly harmless drugs can have side effects that could affect your ability to fly safely.
Then we have stress. Are you feeling overwhelmed, anxious, or sleep-deprived? Stress can have a huge impact on our cognitive function and decision-making, making us more susceptible to errors.
Alcohol, of course, is a big one. We've already covered the FAA's strict rules about alcohol and flying 8 hours from bottle to throttle, no exceptions.
And then there's fatigue. Are you feeling tired, sluggish, or mentally drained? Fatigue can be just as dangerous as alcohol when it comes to impairing our reaction time and judgment.
And finally, emotions. Are you emotionally prepared for the flight? Are there any personal issues, worries, or distractions that might affect your focus? It's important to be honest with yourself and acknowledge if you're not in the right emotional state to fly.
This MSAFE checklist is so valuable that I think everyone should use it, not just pilots.
I absolutely agree. It's a great tool for promoting self-awareness and responsible decision-making, whether you're behind the controls of a plane or just driving to the grocery store.
It's all about taking a moment to check in with yourself and make sure you're in the right condition to operate any vehicle safely.
Speaking of vehicles, let's shift gears and talk about something we touched on earlier, handling chemicals.
Those often overlooked fluids that can be more dangerous than they seem.
Exactly. Hydraulic fluid, engine oil, fuel. These are all substances that need to be handled with care.
They can be corrosive, flammable, and even toxic. Not exactly things you want to be messing around with.
And this is where those handy material safety data sheets, or MSDS, come in. They're like a safety Bible for aircraft fluids, providing detailed information on the hazards, first aid measures, and safe handling procedures.
So if you're ever unsure about how to handle a particular fluid, always consult the MSDS.
Let's quickly recap some general first aid guidelines. Just in case if you get any of these fluids in your eyes, the first step is to flush them with clean water for at least 15 minutes.
And if you get it on your skin, remove any contaminated clothing and wash the affected area thoroughly with soap and water.
For inhalation of fumes, the key is to get to fresh air immediately. If you're experiencing respiratory problems, dizziness, or nausea, seek medical attention right away.
And if you accidentally ingest any of these fluids, do not induce vomiting. Instead, call 911 or your local emergency number immediately.
Remember, it's always better to err on the side of caution when dealing with potentially hazardous materials.
Okay, I think we've covered just about everything we set out to explore in this deep dive into aeromedical factors.
It's been quite a journey, from the heights of the atmosphere to the inner workings of our bodies.
We've learned about the challenges of flying, the importance of pilot health and well-being, and the fascinating interplay between our bodies and the demanding environment of flight.
But the most important takeaway, I think, is that safety is everyone's responsibility.
Whether you're a pilot, a passenger, or just someone who's fascinated by aviation, understanding these aeromedical factors can make us all safer and more informed travelers.
So the next time you're on a plane, take a moment to appreciate the incredible science and human skill that goes into making flight possible.
And remember, a little knowledge can go a long way in ensuring a safe and enjoyable journey for everyone.
That's it for our deep dive into aeromedical factors. We hope you found it informative and insightful.
Until next time, fly safe and keep exploring.